Welcome, everyone. We are going to let all of our participants join. See the number ticking up. Welcome, welcome. Just let everyone arrive. Give folks maybe a minute or so to join. Great, well, welcome. See everyone joining. We'll go ahead and get started just because we have a really wonderful presentation for you today. Welcome to the SGSO-Network, the School Garden Support Organization Network webinar on what makes school gardens thrive. So we've got two key pieces of research on indicators of building successful school gardens we're really excited to share with you today. So just some housekeeping items. There will be a recording of the webinar shared via email after the webinar, and it will also be on our webinar library, which you can find on our website. And we'd love to know your questions. So as they come up throughout the webinar, please go ahead and put them into the chat. We won't be using the Q&A section, we'll be using the chat for questions. So if you have any questions, just put them into the chat and we'll be organizing them and having a Q&A section at the end. And then we would love to receive your feedback. So you can go to this link to share your feedback at the end, and we'll also be sharing that at the end of the webinar. Your feedback really helps us to develop content for our webinars. Well, this is our agenda today. I'll be doing just a quick intro to the School Garden Support Organization Network. We'll share some data about who we are and who is joining today. Then we'll be passing it off to Kate Burt to share about the green tool, and then to Jaimie Davis to share about the school garden landscape survey results. And then finally, we'll close out with Q&A. So just a little bit about the SGSO network. We're an open peer-to-peer learning network, and our goal is to grow, sustain, and elevate a movement for equitable garden-based education. We do that by providing members at a school, district, regional, state, and national level with professional and leadership development, resources, and platforms to connect. Our current avenues for achieving that are webinars or virtual gatherings, in-person gatherings, and our digital commons, including our forum and our newsletter. So you can check all of that out at our website, sgsonetwork.org. We do have another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. It's drip irrigation systems for school gardens. So essentially a virtual training on how to install effective drip irrigation systems. And that will be at April 6th at 11 a.m. Pacific and 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for moving the slides. We did want to share this new resource that we developed ahead of our Growing School Garden Summit, which is an infographic that talks and goes into detail all about why school gardens and what grows in school gardens, how does it impact the students that interact with them, as well as a full list of the research that backs up all of these claims. So it's an amazing resource and one we hope you all can utilize to share the impact of school gardens. Also want to put a plug for our promising practices section of our website. Today we'll be talking about the successful indicators for school gardens and kind of how to have a thriving school garden. And our promising practices section of our website really dives into a number of resources to kind of help you achieve that. Great. So this is who registered for the webinar today. We had over 420 registrants for our webinar, clearly a popular topic. So this is how our registrants broke down in terms of organizations or schools, different types of organizations or entities that they support. So as you can see, the majority are from a nonprofit, followed closely by school or district entity and a school or a college, university, cooperative extensions. Just some interesting data there. And then we also asked you all, what do you consider to be the top 2 most valuable elements related to supporting your school gardens? And the top 1 was dedicated staff, followed closely by funding and teacher buy-in, and then by administrative support. So the 2 groups today will kind of be sharing their research on what are valuable elements to support school gardens. So we'll see how that compares to what you thought in the pre-survey. Great, so I'm going to now pass it off to Kate Burt of Lehman College.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and for hosting this presentation today. I think we're all here because we love school gardens and want to make them effective. So hopefully this will actually help you, everybody in the room, move your garden forward in some way. And today I'm going to share a little bit about the Green Tool, which is a tool that I developed in a research setting during my dissertation research as a PhD student, which has been used in a number of ways. So I'm going to first go over the Green Tool, talk about some resources that you can use today that are alongside that work alongside the Green Tool, and I'll talk about a few different uses and how people can use this to achieve better community, a community network to support their school garden. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what you'll see on the right side of this slide is the Green Tool. It is the green circle, and I'm going to describe many of the things that you see inside and around the circle now. But essentially what this does is describe what a successful school garden looks like and how we can talk about integrating a garden. So when we talk about a successful school garden, what we mean is a garden that is established and maintained, and that it's sustained and used as an educational tool in a school in some way. And there's no one size fits all approach to gardening, and there's no curriculum or for different schools have different gardens for different reasons. And so the Green Tool is essentially a tool that can be used to capture all of those things. And we can use the Green Tool to understand how to establish different kinds of gardens and across a continuum. So each of these components inside the green circle, I'm calling each of those boxes in there components. So each of those components describes a different important factor. And we're going to go through each of those now so that we can really understand what goes into sustaining a garden and how to achieve that over time, because this is a tool that is not just a one-time, one-size-fits-all. This can be used throughout, and to continuously evaluate your garden program to see if you're achieving your goals. Next slide, please. So we're going to start at the top at 12 o'clock here. So hopefully my branching out with the big circle can help you follow exactly what I'm talking about here. This is the resources and support domain at the top. We start here because this is foundational in some ways. There are some things that you need to start off with to get your garden going. Probably everybody in this room knows that already, and you've maybe gotten some of these things together and not all of them. So there are ways that you can better support your garden in each of these component areas. Many people start with these first couple things: networks or partner organization. You're already connected to a school gardening network. That's what brought you here today. And you have some kind of budget or small funding or the equivalent of some kind of budget and funding to get your garden going. You perhaps had to build garden beds or purchase seeds or other resources that you might need. So most school gardeners start with at least a few of these components in the resources and support category. You'll notice though that there are concentric circles moving inside. So though you can get a garden started with just a little bit of a network and some budget and funding, you really need a little bit more to make sure that it is well established and resourced to begin with. Not everybody starts with that, but you can always come back to that. And we're going to talk about the flow around the Green Tool at the end. I'm going to keep referring to it throughout. So again, you can start a garden with just this outer ring of resources and support, but once you move inside, you're going to better establish and better support your garden so that eventually it will be sustained. So these things that you see inside here on the left side of the screen, you can see that there's administrative support and professional development. I know administrative support was something that just came up on the previous few slides that you responded to in the pre-webinar survey. Many of you thought that administrative support was valuable to have. Professional development as well, and that can include professional development for teachers or for administrators or anybody else who might be caring for the garden. Professional development can also be very loosely defined. It doesn't necessarily have to be trainings of sorts from professionals, but professional development can also happen around gardens from peer to peer or in different kinds of settings. It doesn't just have to be in the garden. It can be curriculum design and development around gardening related tasks as well. But some kind of professional development will help a garden become better resourced and sustained in a school, better supported and sustained in the school. Then all of these things typically lead to a stronger organizational structure for the garden. That is, if there are people at the school and there are people outside of the school, there is some support in terms of funding there, then you start to see the organizational structure of a school garden committee or sometimes a wellness committee or otherwise form within the school. It's a structural network to provide ongoing support to the garden. Ultimately, all of these things come together, and that's really the best way to provide a foundation for a well-integrated school garden. The organizational structure is a bit harder, and so you'll see that's in a concentric circle category as you approach to the well-integrated garden. So we're really moving in from the ones that people start with and maybe are not necessarily going to lead to a sustained garden to the most difficult on the inner circle. And this is Cleo. She will probably walk through this webinar many times. We can say hi to Cleo. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what you'll see on the right side, excuse me, at around 3 o'clock, you'll see the physical garden domain. So yeah, many hellos to Cleo. So inside the physical garden domain, you'll notice that the outermost circle contains a component that we call planning and establishing the garden. Planning and establishing the garden, as you know, is in a different iteration every year. And so this is not a one-time thing that you do. You're probably continuously planning and establishing new parts of your garden or changing parts of your garden to serve your needs. That's a necessary thing to do to make sure that the physical garden is maintained. But if you want to make sure that it's sustained between seasons, you need to make sure that the characteristics of the garden and the garden care and upkeep are something that's manageable. And so it's really important to be able to focus on those as necessary components of a sustained garden. That is one that can be maintained given the support structure in place. Oh, I see that there might be an issue with the slides. Perhaps I should pause. Great, thank you. So I'm sorry, I don't have the chat open right now. Okay, great, I'm gonna keep going. So in the physical domain section, you can see when you move into a further concentric circle, you wanna also conduct some kind of evaluation or collect feedback. And most often people are doing this within schools related to the physical garden space. Like, is it serving the needs of the teachers? Is it serving the needs of the students, other stakeholders? And could it be used more effectively? So most often the evaluation and feedback that's happening is about the physical space and how it's used by one or more groups. And then also an important thing that we all want to see is vital and diverse crops, and that really does support the garden to have different kinds of crops for both, from a gardening standpoint and also from a curriculum standpoint. So that's one of the things that you can really focus on after you get the other foundational components established in your physical space. Next slide, please. So this is the student experience domain, which is perhaps where we spend, at least teachers spend the most amount of time probably thinking and doing, but this really is not the first place that people go when thinking about a sustained garden over time. The resources and support and the physical garden itself kind of inform what the student experience is like. So what I mean by that is if you have thought about how your garden will be used and the space serves those uses well, the student experience can be enhanced through that. And so we always start off with the curriculum connections first. After that, that usually leads to activities for students in the garden and time spent in the garden, which are both critical components of learning in the garden and might be obvious, but needed to have a place in a tool describing what a well-integrated garden looks like, because they lead to engagement. And engagement is critical for the learning outcomes to be achieved. So sometimes that engagement can lead to tasting in the garden, and there can be a lot resulting from any produce that is harvested, or it can lead to either tasting and or additional learning outcomes for students. And we can think of those as some of the soft skills that they learn, things like teamwork and collaboration, self-confidence, things like that that aren't directly connected to the curriculum or tied to the curriculum, but they're goals and outcomes of garden learning that we know. And then finally, there's the school community domain. Slide, please. Thank you. So this is all the way on the left side. And, you know, part of why there's only 3 components here is probably because this is the least understood area in terms of how to achieve integration in this way. We know it's important. We know the community connection is important. All of you do too. I'm sure that's why you're here. But how that really works looks very, very different. And so what we know about what a sustained school garden requires is that there needs to be some kind of volunteer and parent involvement. I mean, ideally there would be paid professionals doing this work, but we know that that's typically not the case. So sustained school gardens typically have essentially a revolving door of volunteers, either that they recruit themselves or that they work with PTOs or that they work with their partner organizations with. And those can lead to social events and larger community events in the garden. And ultimately, those inform school policies around the use of the garden, around food, and around a number of other things that could be connected to gardening related outcomes that we all want to see. So not only those learning outcomes, but outcomes for social outcomes and community outcomes as well. So those different domains, so I went through it very quickly. There are a number of resources, as I see John is making available in the chat right now. And there are a number of resources available to you as a result of this webinar that you can really dig into to try to better understand garden integration. Next slide, please. So I want to touch for a minute on how do you use this in a practical way? Because, you know, the circle is nice and it's pretty to look at and it's got green and brown and maybe reminds us of the garden, but it's not something actionable that you can take. This scorecard is. So essentially what this scorecard is a way for you or gardens that you work with to rate themselves in each of these different areas as low, medium, or high to try to identify your strengths and areas for improvement. I'm not going to go through each item on the scorecard because it directly correlates with all of the things that I just went through in the green tool. But I do want to make sure that you know that it's available for use for you. And there's a number of ways that organizations and schools themselves are using this. For example, Grow NYC, which coordinates school gardens in New York City, gives this to school gardens every year when they apply for mini grant funding. And they work with gardens, with individual gardens specifically to rate them at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, and they use it for goal setting. So wherever they are at the beginning of the year, they identify areas they want to improve in, discuss ways that they're going to do it, and then by the end of the year, they complete the scorecard again and try to figure out where the change happened and did it meet their goals. So I encourage you all to try to use the scorecard in that way. You can also use it for assessment, or you can use it to recruit people into different roles, playing to their strengths and the ways that they would like to be involved in the garden. Next slide, please. So we also want to, and I'm going to share a little bit about some of my most recent research, because we also want to make sure that a successful garden really has all of the important factors, many of which Jaimie and Katie are going to speak about in a minute. I'm going to focus on one right now, which is community interest and community partners. Next slide, please. And recently, in talking to a number of school garden experts, community members, we've come up with a list of ways. Here are some of our findings right here about the ways that you can better integrate your garden with the community or engage the community in different ways. And community is broadly defined, but I will read a couple items off of this list. So you want to try to leverage technology as best you can, including things like QR code signage, especially for parents outside the school who might not have access to a lot of information about the garden, is a great way to include parents or community members in that. You could also host events, create a website and orientation for teachers, or have students publish an online garden newsletter. Oh, I see somebody already says that they use QR codes, so that's fantastic. I hope that you can type a little bit about your experience in the chat or share it during the Q&A. I'm really curious to know how they work and what else that you'd like to, how you'd improve that if you could. You also want to start by networking. Most people don't focus enough on networking, and that seemed to be something that was coming up a lot in this most recent research that I was doing about how to better connect with the community. So you want to start with all of your local organizations, and that can include community businesses, youth groups, senior groups, and other groups that might use the garden when the school is not in use. I think summer use is something that for many gardens who aren't in a dense network, they struggle to try to connect to the community, to community groups. So it's important to develop your network. And then of course, you want to connect to the garden, to the school in as many ways as possible. So most of the work that people, most of the recommendations that people made in this research was really, were focused on how to better connect the school and the garden within the school community. So that includes bringing guest speakers. I love this idea of providing a weather report from the garden by the students as part of the daily announcements. I also found out myself about LCAP funds, Local Control Accountability Plan funds, that can be used to hire a garden and nutrition educator. Also, to the best that you can, scaffold the curriculum between grades and between units or educational units is very helpful to make sure that there's more, that you're getting the students to the garden regularly. And I like this idea of a garden competition, of course. Suggestions included who can grow the biggest squash, who can husk corn the fastest, and I bet this group could come up with a number of great ways that we could have garden competitions. Feel free to throw them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand it over to Jaimie Davis, who will tell you a little bit more about those really important components for success.
Thanks, Kate. Appreciate it. I'm Jaimie Davis, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And I also want to introduce Katie Nika, who is the senior project manager of my lab and runs all things. All right, next slide. Okay, a little bit about our website. EDEN stands for Educate, Evaluate, and Nutrition. And at the end, there'll be a link and you can go check out all the resources that we have. We have many different programs, and I'm not going to spend time talking about them, but you can find out more information about our undergraduate interns program that we have, as well as our Sprouting Teachers program, which provides trainings to teachers and administrators. And we have an NIH-funded grant evidence-based project that showed that Texas Sprouts resulted in a number of health outcomes in kids. And you can read all about those findings in the various papers that have been posted to the SGSO website. Today, we're going to talk about the school garden landscape, though. Next slide. All right, so off of our NIH grant, we realized we started that evidence-based project, and we realized that schools in Central Texas were still really struggling with sustaining and maintaining those school garden programs. And based off of, we adapted the green tool that Kate just mentioned to you. And it has the 4 domains that she mentioned: the resource and support, the physical garden, student experience, and school communities. And we took it a little step further. We actually had a panel of 10 experts that worked closely with our different schools across the greater Austin area, rank the schools as being thriving or needing improvement. I'm going to give a special, this was a project that was in combination with Edwin Marty, who is the Director of Sustainability of the City of Austin, and Ann Mueller, who is an AISD Outdoor Learning Specialist at Austin ISD. Next slide. So data was collected on school gardens across the greater Austin area, and we had 523 school teachers and 170 full school administrators from 109 schools from 8 different independent school districts. The demographics of the school, most of them were eligible for free and reduced lunch or Title I. Most of them were largely Hispanic, and the majority were also elementary schools. And we identified, the expert panel identified 23% of the schools were identified as being thriving. Next slide. We asked the teachers, so we had the teachers fill it out and we had the administrators fill it out separately. And I think it's interesting, you're going to see different barriers reported by each. So, and this also varies a little bit from the survey that was taken before this webinar. That the top barriers that teachers mentioned to having a school garden was funding, administrative and district support, work days and community involvement, teacher involvement, access and availability, and then right at the 50% was also knowing what to do with their harvest. But in contrast, next slide, the administrators reported different barriers. They did not think that it was them, obviously. They did think that teacher involvement was a big barrier, as well as having training and knowledge of different curriculum and funding were the top 3 barriers that administrators reported. Next slide. So teachers with underutilized gardens reported needing more teacher training. They reported needing more garden-specific curriculum, also needing help with leadership, specifically around garden committees. And all of these findings you can read in the paper below, which is, again, the PDF is linked in the SGSO on the website. Next slide. So back to kind of our analysis that we did, we had, 23% of the schools were categorized as being thriving. And so we did regression analysis and we looked at which predictors, which barriers and strategies utilized by the teachers and administrators were most linked to having a thriving garden. And having funding and having community partners were linked to a 3-fold increase in having a thriving garden. Having teacher training, garden leadership committees, and having a garden curriculum were linked to a 5-fold increase. And then having administrator support or adequate administrator support was linked to a 12-fold increase in having a thriving garden. Next slide. So we took that information and we actually met with experts, many of who are on this call today, to help us modify the survey even more. And we added some COVID-related questions, and the final survey is 65 items. And I know many of you guys on this call also took the survey for us, and I'm going to be sharing with the very preliminary data from those results. The average time it takes is about 15 minutes. And we disseminated this survey nationwide on this SGSO network. It's also integrated into the Eden website. To date, we have 229 completed surveys. And I'm going to share with you many slides on the preliminary results. And super exciting is we have a digitized scorecard. So once you take the survey, you'll get your scorecard back outlining where it is, which domain you need help and work in. And we're going to actually launch it live at the Growing School Garden Summit end of April. And I'll let you know for sure, but we're hoping April 1st, the scorecard will be officially ready. We're very close. We're in the final stages of being able to have it launched. And the idea is once you take it, you would not only get the results immediately, but you'd have a PDF of the results sent to your email. And this is a great thing that you can share with your administrators. You can share with your other teachers. It might just be a great place to start, like, where do we need help? Because that's one thing that we found that most schools don't realize. They have this great garden program. They don't even know where it is that they need help and where to start. Next slide. So some demographics on the surveys completed. So we actually had 346 start the survey, but only 229 finished it. And we were super thrilled about this, but 40 different states were represented. And we had 6 international groups fill it out. The majority of the schools were elementary, followed by pre-K or K through 8, and then high school, and then middle school. The population ranged anywhere from 50 all the way up to over 700. The primary role of the person who filled this out was there was a mixture, but we had teachers and staff, that was about a third, and administrators, we had fewer administrators fill this out. We definitely want to increase that number moving forward. We had a lot of garden coordinators or leads that filled this out, and we had some volunteer and community members, some PTA and parents that filled this out. Next slide. So when we asked 2 questions on COVID, and this will come to no surprise here, but when it was asked how COVID impacted how often students interact with the garden, the majority of people said that they have interacted less with the garden since COVID, and that's not surprising. There's actually a few that actually said that they interacted more, which is exciting. And then did COVID change plans for outdoor learning? And the majority did say yes. 45% reported having a partner organization help with the school garden, and 73% reported having a garden committee. And you can see the breakdown of the members of the committee. Seems like it was kind of fairly split, but majority is, or sorry, about a quarter is teachers, about a fifth is garden coordinators, and some parents and some community members, less on the student side and administrators. 26% of garden committees never met, which was kind of shocking to us as well. Whereas a quarter met once a semester or 3 times every 3 months, 19% met monthly, and 10% met weekly or even every other week. And then looking at the trainings that the schools received on school gardening, and it's missing some of the labels here. Katie, do you remember what the biggest one was? I think that one was 2 or 3 per year. I don't know where the labels went on that. Anyway, we saw that there was some schools that had no trainings per year. So we still have got some work to do in this area. Okay, next slide. 83% reported having a garden coordinator, which is fantastic. 65% of reported that they were the garden coordinator filling out the survey. And then when we looked at the different type of funding sources for the garden coordinator, grants made up about 22% of it, partner organizations made up about 22%, the school budget 11%, and other garden fundraisers around 11%. And then the budget also varied as far as what the support was. And again, we're missing some slides or some bullet points here, but I remember this slide that none is about 16%, and the next largest category was over 2,000. So there was definitely some varying garden support levels. And then looking at, we asked for each of the domains, we asked the survey respondents to report if they thought their resources and support were either good, fair, excellent. Fewer numbers said excellent, the majority said good. And then we had about a third that said fair. So again, I think this is a domain that we could really use some additional support in. And then when we asked if there was adequate administrator support, 35% said very supportive, 31% said somewhat supportive, and then we had a smaller percent that said not supportive at all. Next slide. When you're looking at the domain as the physical garden, we asked how well maintained your school garden is, and almost half said well. And that's not surprising given especially the people that are filling out this survey. These seem to be more of the schools that have gardens and have garden programs in place. About a third said decently, 18% said somewhat, and then we had less than 6% that said poor, unmaintained. Looking at how many community or school-wide garden work days per year, I thought this was super interesting. The largest percent was 1 to 2 per year. Again, the slides are messed up here.
About 31%.
31% for the 1 to 2.
Yep.
Okay, and then what about 3 to 4?
3 to 4 is 14%. 5 to 6 is about 8%, and then more than 6 per year is 16%.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Katie. And then when we looked at the harvest use, the majority of you guys used the harvest for lessons or taste tests, whereas the next biggest chunk was family and community. Okay, next slide. Looking at domain C, which is the student and teacher experience, 67% use a special curriculum. And out of that curriculum, the largest percent was 20% was either adapt a district or school curriculum of their own. 20% was a mix or other. 8% use a local nonprofit, and then 13% use a curriculum from another nonprofit as USDA, JMG, Slow Food, Life Lab, Edible Schoolyard, Food Corps, Kids Gardening, and Whole Kids Foundation. Many of you guys represent those foundations on this call. And then teaching use in the garden, we saw that there was about a third that used it weekly. 10% used it monthly, and then there was a small handful that used it more than weekly, which is super exciting. When you looked at non-curricular garden use, the biggest percentages were people wanted time outside, and wellness was also up there, which is exciting. Being a dietitian, I like to see that. And next slide. We also looked at kind of the student visitations per year, and we see that there's a small handful that actually get out there daily, which is impressive. About a third use it one to two times per week, 20% 1 to 2 times per month, 10% 1 to 2 times per semester, and then so forth down. When you look, when we asked what the value of a school garden was, we see the top 3 reasons that that our respondents value the garden is it increases student connection to nature, promotion of hands-on learning, and a connection to where your food comes from. And other things to mention are promotion of environmental stewardship and improvements in health and nutrition. And we're also missing our ratings of student teacher.
So on that one, it's they said, you know, the excellent was 8%. Good was 19%, and some was about 52%. So the majority kind of thought their student teacher experience was neutral, basically.
And we'll make sure to get a clean version of this presentation and put it on our webinar archive library for those that want to reference these slides later. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thanks, John. Okay, next slide. And then looking at the school community, the final domain, which many of you guys can attest to, getting volunteers to support your school garden is challenging. The majority of schools have between 1 to 10 volunteers that work at their school garden per year. A smaller, several said none, which I think that's a really, if your school has a none category, that's one not easy area, but one area that could use improvement. And then we'll have resources to kind of connect you to different volunteers locally and nationally. And then we had a smaller percentage that had, 11 or more. The types of volunteers also varied. We see, again, several had none, but the majority are parents and caregivers, followed by community members, and then outside organizations or company was less. I think that there's also an underutilization of older grade level students, which we see reported in this survey, as well as utilizing academic partners like university students or staff to help. And then we asked about, how the respondents rate the school community garden. It's pretty neutral as well. The majority said some, very few said we have an excellent, excellent or good school community as far as kind of volunteers go. Next slide. Then we asked you guys what your biggest contributors to success was, and this differed from our previous findings. And we see that the biggest contributor to success is actually having a garden coordinator. So 37% reported that, followed by teacher and student usage, having a well-maintained garden. So if your garden's upkept, it's easier to be able to use it. And then the fourth one was having administrator support. And you can see the other, there was some voting on the other categories. Next slide. And then looking at barriers and strategies, we're missing this as well. Katie, you want to fill it in?
Yep. So the future success of the garden, we were asking, the first response was, if I left as the garden coordinator or the lead, the garden would fail. And 48% of the respondents said that was true for them. 32% said that their team would continue, the success of the garden would continue, and about 15% said administrative support would help keep the garden going.
Thanks. And then future success of garden. I'm pulling up my other slide so I can see it. You want to?
Oh, sorry, that was future success of garden. The barriers, I just realized that I went in the opposite order. Time constraints was the biggest at 37%, and then lack of teacher involvement, 14%. Other, which had a lot of various things, but funding was a really big one in there. So we had lack of physical resources. So combining those would be about 18%. So that's really the second biggest barrier.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of go back to it. And again, the slides will be on there, but almost a half of respondents who filled this out said, if I left, the garden would fail. And so I think that just goes to show that many of us who've done school garden work, we know that sometimes there's one or two champions that really kind of lead up the school garden. And if they leave, what happens? And so it's probably, really eye-opening that we need to probably train more, have more of a leadership team in place and train more of our teachers and or parents so that it's not just left up to one or two people. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, all of this, you'll be able to take this survey and you'll get a scorecard immediately, and then you'll have a PDF sent to your email. But it will line out where you need, with the brown being kind of needs the most support, and the green being needs the less support. So you'll be able to kind of show these back to your teachers. You'll be able to use this to look for resources on where you need help. And then underneath, this is all just text type right now. We need to fix it, but you'll see that where the pointers are. So we'll have some tips underneath there. And then the idea would be is on our site, we'll direct you to local and national resources that can help you improve in each of the domains. And that's also where the SGSO network comes in handy, is that's also a resource. And many of you guys have nonprofits that are a resource. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel with resources. We're really trying to connect schools with where they need help and then connect them to the resources that are already existing, or figure out if there are additional resources that need to be provided. Next slide. So again, you can check all of this out at our website, which is listed here. And underneath you can, so starting April 1st, I would wait a couple weeks and then fill out the survey if you want your actual scorecard. And I'll work with John to kind of push out a message when it's officially ready to notify you guys. And then underneath in our website will also be kind of resources. We have curated curriculum. We have different types of programs. We have different types of lessons. We also have a video bank that has lessons and activities and tastings and free past webinars, as well as, like I said, linking out to various nonprofits and organizations across the nation that have similar types of resources. Next slide. Yeah, and then just to kind of wrap up, that we have a lot of things on our site. And as I mentioned, we have Sprouting Teachers, which is a program that we fund to help train school teachers, both virtually and in person. We're about to get a really awesome University of Texas teaching garden right next to our tower, which is exciting. We are launching the National School Garden Survey, which you'll be able to get your scorecards. We have a ton of work done on Texas Sprouts, so you can read about the evidence-based effects of a school garden program on health outcomes. We're also pilot testing some cook and grow kits where schools can actually go online. Hopefully, eventually it'll be something you can click, and we're partnering with local grocery stores and national grocery stores to be able to, the schools can purchase cook kits that go along with the lessons so that they don't have to go to the store and it's all kind of comes to them. We're pilot testing it right now with 10 teachers and it's going really well. We're getting great feedback from it and we'd like to actually push that bigger, and we've got a couple grants that are proposing that. And then we have numerous Eden interns. So we have a 2-semester required nutrition course. At UT Austin, we have over 500 nutrition students, undergraduates, and we've had to date 150 go through this program where we match them with preceptors This unfortunately is more localized because they have to physically go and teach at the schools. So we work mainly in the greater Austin area on this. But we hope to expand the resources online so that other universities can adapt a similar type program and maybe offer this program to other, cities and states. And finally, we have Texas Sprouts 2.0, which is an NIH grant that is under review. It got a really good score on the first round, and we just resubmitted it. And it's to work with Texas A&M AgriLife to expand on Texas Sprouts and to teach the Texas Sprouts in schools in Dallas and Austin areas moving forward. So super exciting stuff coming up. Please check out our website. We'd love to hear from you. So the next steps are to evaluate the current program, continue to evaluate the national survey so that we can see where we need help and where certain regions can use additional resources and material. Continue to evaluate the effects of school garden programs on health parameters. We've got several grants in the works on that. And then also to stay plugged in with the SGSO and let local partners to continue highlighting the great work across our nation in the world of school gardens. I'd like to thank all of our partnerships. We have many funding partnerships as well as academic institutions that we partner with. Big shout out to Sprouts Healthy Communities Foundation, which funded a lot of our different programming.
All right. Well, thank you, Jaimie and Katie and Kate. I apologize for those slide snafus, but I just put a link in the chat and I will put a clean copy that has the right graphics that weren't skewed by the end of the day today. So if you go to our sgso-network.org/webinar-library, you can download a copy of this and the recording will be up shortly after. So I'll also add the links that we've been chatting about, like the green tool. And that leads to one of the first questions that we had. Someone asked, that was Paula, is it okay for someone to use the image of the green tool and put it on their website, Kate?
Absolutely. I would be happy for you to do that. I'd appreciate knowing that it was there. If you could shoot me an email and tell me that it's going to be up there, but absolutely, please feel free to use it. Describe how you're using it. I think it's really useful. There's been a lot of learning within, I'm mostly based in New York City, so most connected to my local organizations, but there's been a lot of learning that's happened among gardeners by sharing these ideas with each other. So, please use it, share it. I'm for all of the data sharing.
Great. And I guess I'll extend that question to Jaimie and Katie. If people were to want to share some of these infographics or the charts, is that something they can do if they credit you?
Absolutely, yeah. And you'll get a PDF when you take the survey. And we really want you to share that information. We want you to take it to your administrators and your teacher groups and your schools and use it as, this is where we need help. This is where we're excelling. This is where we need work.
Great. And I saw in the chat, people are looking for emails. If you want to share your emails, Katie and Jaimie, please do. And then we will, on our webinar archive page, we'll put links to your websites and such so people could find a link to your university pages where you're represented. So we'll get that up there. Before I go to the next question, I just want to remind folks that you can share feedback about this webinar at the link that is on the screen right now at bit.ly/SGSO-feedback. It's a really brief form, but we like to then share that input with our presenters and then just get better ideas of how to bring a better webinar the next time. And we also have a space in that feedback survey where you can suggest topics. So like, for example, the topic we're having on April 6th on drip irrigation was suggested by one of our members saying like, hey, I need to learn about drip irrigation. And one of our members said, great, I just know how to do that and I'll share a webinar. So we're peer-to-peer. So share your ideas there. So the next question I have here was about LCAP, Local Control Accountability Program, I believe is how it goes. And I know Kate, you put a link in our chat about California's LCAP. Do you want to share a little bit about LCAP, about what you've learned about that?
I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert on this, but I have become familiar with many funding pockets that are, I'm not even going to focus on California's LCAP specifically, because I've come to know that these little funding pockets exist in different places depending on where you are. But there is typically kind of funding within either educational departments or, as you can see through the link that I shared with California, that's through their Department of Education as well. And so this funding that they make available is really for anything that supports student learning that's not directly in the classroom. I suppose maybe it could be in the classroom, but usually there's pockets of money for extracurricular kinds of projects, including gardening, and it can be applied to gardening and used in classrooms or outside. And people have found this very useful, especially in California, where I first heard about this, but also I'm familiar with the sources in New York as well. And they have used it for such a range of things, from like actually building garden beds or things that materials you need for the garden, to professional development. If you want to pay experts to come in, talk about composting or drip irrigation, which you won't need after the next webinar. But theoretically, if you did need some help with drip irrigation, this could be a potential use of those funds to improve your school garden.
Great, and I'll add to that LCAP. It's also called LCFF, local control funded formulas or funding formulas, and in our state, it's a whole bunch of money that goes to certain districts in California, and it's the community that dictates how the money gets spent. And so we have seen districts in California say, I want to see that money to fund garden educators or nutrition ed. In one of our districts we partner with, it's funding VAPA, visual and performing arts, and it funds a lot of money. Like there are 25 full-time teacher staff that now serve our district, and it funds special programming, like analogous to getting materials from the garden, and it brings in artists from our community. So that is the context within our LCAP. In one of the districts we work with, it funds visual and performing arts because the community said they wanted that. But we've seen other communities in California that say we want to see that for gardeners, and it funds garden education. So the take-home message, I think, that kind of summarizes to what Kate said, is there are pockets of money that you can find in different places. And one person that started the school garden program in San Francisco, she always said, just show up to meetings, just keep showing up. And her example is she showed up onto a meetings that were talking about bonds to renovate schools. And what that ended up was all the schools in San Francisco got $150,000 to $250,000 to build outdoor green spaces. And that was big money. Of course, it was doing lights and heating and air conditioning systems too, because it was for green schools, but they funded their outdoor spaces as well. And showing up to the right meetings, asking questions, sharing the work that you do, doing a scorecard, using a green tool, type of survey to identify what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then share those out, is a great way to start this kind of journey to find strong funding sources. So I see another question. Someone said, can you say more about QR codes? And Sheila's calling herself a dinosaur. So dinosaurs didn't use QR codes. So that is true. QR codes are just those little like square barcodes that you scan. Now, when you go to restaurants, most of the time you're scanning a little square barcode, and people print those barcodes and put them in their garden so that folks could then scan them, and then on their phone, it'll give them instruction. Whether that's, I've seen people use them for teachers when they leave the garden, they scan the QR code and then they fill out a survey like, we taught science, I had 15 kids with me. So I've seen it for evaluation purposes. I've also seen it for other purposes to instruct folks on ways to engage in the garden.
I'll just add on, a really neat way to do is to put QR codes by different produce growing. And, you can scan it and then learn about, the benefits of a turnip, or, if you have a rainwater collection, you can scan that and learn about how that's good for water conservation. And so there's a lot of learning pieces around it. So instead of just using a simple label to label something in the garden, think about adding a QR code and then some education material with it.
And I just wanted to add too, Sheila, I was intimidated by QR codes. It's really simple. All you have to do to use a QR code is open the camera on your phone and just hold it at the QR code. Then a little link pops up, you click it, and it brings you to where you need to go. So it's very easy from a user perspective. I recently just got on board, like within the last few months. So I'm new, you can do it.
And to make your own QR code, yes, someone just wrote there, you just go to a website and say QR code generator, and you just paste in your web link, and then it gives you an image that's the QR code that then you could copy or download. Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of applications for QR codes that could be employed for, requesting donations, giving instruction, doing assessment. I saw another question here. What tools can be used to show evaluations of how the school gardens are doing? And then they wrote to prove to teachers, parents, and student bodies and administration that this is something worth growing towards or working towards. So I'll leave that to our panelists to start, and I'll pull up a link where we have a lot of examples of these tools. So what are tools?
Yeah, John, I'll just add it. I think it depends on what your outcomes are. We have a lot of, I do more health related stuff. So there's a lot of data that suggests that school gardens can improve nutrition, physical activity, improve time on task, mental health. So we've used several different types of questionnaires in our group, and I'm happy to pass that along to you, John, so you can put that online if you wanted to download those. And I know that there are already some on y'all's website that show that. But I would also, oh, sorry, Kate, I was just gonna say, so you could use the survey that either the green tool or the one on our site, because you can show that you're improving in one area. Like for example, if you get more student usage, that can show your principal where we increased our usage by 50% over the past year.
I'd also add to that, that I second the idea that you need to know what your outcomes are, and you should probably decide on those based on whoever you're trying to appeal to. So your stakeholder interests, like if your administration is really focused on students learning science, then demonstrate with science in some way that it's improving science learning. But another set of tools and resources that I think is included in some of the resources that you'll receive today is a link to Farming Concrete's toolkit. Inside this toolkit is a number of different actual worksheets that you can use to measure different things, from how much produce you've grown to how many community members interact in your garden. So they're really easy to use. And if you're just looking for a worksheet you can use right now that's simple, turn to the Farming Concrete toolkit.
Great, and we'll get that link in there. But that toolkit Kate just turned me on to. It's incredible. There are so many different types of assessment tools if you're doing gardening, from harvesting crops to tracking your volunteers and beyond. And that is linked to on the evaluation link that I put up there. But I will say that we have so many evaluation tools. If you go to the link that I put up there that says SGSO-Network.org/evaluation, it takes you to all these pages of resources that were shared by our peers, the other folks that do this work. And so you can go deep there and find some incredible resources. So we're at the end of our time. So I do truly want to thank Jaimie and Katie and Kate for taking time out of their busy schedules and sharing what they had to share. We will give you a summary on our archive page of all the resources and links that we shared throughout the day. And just a shout out to the SGSO Network. In this slide here is Tristana, who's the director of the SGSO Network. So reach out to her with any questions or ideas as we move forward in this journey, creating and sustaining school gardens. So thanks a lot for being here with us, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you and goodbye.